Thank you so much and good afternoon to everyone. And apologies for slight changes in the schedule on the press briefing. And this is because there were some changes in the session timings. Actually, the session on response to pandemic is still going on. And in fact, Honorable Minister is attending that session. So because of that, he was unable to address you all. So today, actually, the formal discussion started. The subject-wise thematic sessions started, and today, basically, the thematic sessions are on response to pandemic. So it has three important elements in it. The first element is the overarching response to pandemic paper, which has been under discussion, and linked to that is the second important vertical of TRIPS waiver proposal, uh, which has been under negotiation from quite some time. And post lunch, there are sessions on agriculture, the food security part of response to pandemic, as to what needs to be done to basically deal with the current and future pandemics. So the sessions on response to pandemic, they began in the morning, and uh, the session, as I mentioned, is still going on. Maybe it will. I think it has been extended up to 3 p.m. So after that, the agri sessions will start. To give a brief background of these three main verticals, the response to pandemic is a overarching paper, the the text which is under discussion from quite some time, and it has elements related to how trade should be facilitated in the time of pandemic, how uh, export restrictions so export restrictions, how trade measures which are taken during the time of pandemic, what should be the uh, policies regarding that, what should be the disciplines regarding that, what should be the approach regarding that. So that is one element. The second element is on uh, how services play an important role during the pandemic. Uh, some services they get affected, especially the contact services they get affected during pandemic, and some nations face a lot of challenges because of that. And then what is the role of services in economic recovery? So uh, what kind of sectors which are important, like logistics, travel and tourism. So these are the important things which are covered in that. The third element of response to pandemic is pertaining to transparency. So countries take different kind of measures in dealing with the pandemic. So those measures, if they affect trade of, if they affect international trade, so how should members come out with those measures in public domain, so that entire membership knows about those measures, and then they can take uh, actions, and they can also design their policies accordingly. So that is the third important, transparency is the third important vertical of the response to pandemic. The most important fourth vertical is the intellectual property rights, how flexibilities under the TRIPS agreement, the trade related intellectual property rights, how they need to be uh, used to deal with the pandemic. So these are essentially the important elements of the response to the pandemic. And again, in that, all countries are not equally affected by pandemic. Some countries which are more dependent on certain type of services, certain type of goods, they get more affected by pandemic, and therefore how we should prioritize our response in a manner that those countries, they are able to recover very fast, they are able to deal and also recover fast. So these are the essential elements of the response to pandemic paper. And uh, India's view has always been that one TRIPS is a very important element of this. And Uh, in that, we have been saying that the TRIPS waiver proposal which India has given, which basically seeks waiver of intellectual property rights for a particular duration during the pandemic time. So we feel that that is a very, very important element, and decision on that is very important to make the entire response to the pandemic credible. So that is an important element on which there is a separate text which is under discussion. So there are two texts which are under discussion. There is one overarching text, and then there is a text on TRIPS. So the text on TRIPS will go into the overarching text finally. So there is a placeholder for that in the response to pandemic text. So India's view has been that TRIPS is very important, and intellectual property right related flexibilities are very critical to deal with the pandemic. The second point on export restrictions, India has always been saying that export restrictions cannot be, we cannot take restrictions which are beyond the current policy space which is available in the agreements, and restrictions are imposed on account of scarcity which happens during the pandemic. So you cannot have a blanket discipline on no export restrictions. So we feel that it has to be a measured response, and it has to be in accordance with the existing policy space which is already there in the agreement. On transparency, we are fine that yes, there has to be transparency, and we should know about measures of different countries, and we need to move in that direction. But we also need to take into account different capacities across different members. The developed country members have higher capacity in terms of notifying, coming out with detailed description of their measures and also impact. But LDCs and developing countries may not be able to comply with onerous transparency requirements. So though transparency is good, it cannot be same for everyone. So but we feel that transparency is required. And on services, we feel that in fact this has been a contribution of India in the entire response to pandemic, apart from the TRIPS waiver proposal, which is the major thing. That services get affected during pandemic, especially services like tourism, transportation, logistics. They all were severely affected during the pandemic. So they are the services on which immediate relief is required. Also, some services are required to deal with the pandemic, like your ICT services, the IT and the IT enabled services. A lot of critical services, it could be telemedicine, it could be running of critical infrastructure, IT infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure. So all that was managed because of these IT and IT enabled services. And so India has highlighted that these are important services, and we need to ensure that we remove if the barriers which are there, which come in the way of realization of full potential of these services. Uh, India has also said that there is a need for certain type of services like telemedicine services. So there has to be some mechanism of mutual recognition of each other's digital applications. So digital health application in India, if it is recognized by another country, so doctors and health professionals here can also deliver their services across the border and vice versa. So India has been pushing for that, and we feel that that is an important thing which is required in dealing with the pandemic and ramping up the manufacturing capacity, ensuring that all these things are easily available at an affordable cost. So the discussions are still going on. We are yet to kind of reach a consensus on the final text as far as response to pandemic is concerned, as well as the TRIPS waiver element is concerned in that, and discussions are still ongoing. On the food security, there are two elements which are there for discussion today. One is on a declaration on food security as to how food security is very important, and how it can ensure that during the pandemic people don't go hungry. And the second link to that is uh, ban on export restrictions on World Food Program procurements. So that is the second element which is connected to that. And in that, India's position has been that World Food Program is fine. It's a narrow program. It has limited reach. So in addition to World Food Program, there should be also a provision to allow G2G transfer of food grains, sale of food grains. So that is an additional element which India has proposed, that it should also be part of food security to make it credible. So these are the elements which will now come up in discussion post 3 p.m. Session, and we'll see how the discussions go. And we also had a bilateral today with EU. It was a very productive bilateral meeting which happened in the morning, and there was discussion on a number of subjects, all the important subjects which are there before the membership, ranging from e-commerce, agriculture, response to pandemic, TRIPS waiver proposal. So all these proposals were discussed, and there was a good exchange of each other's views on these subjects. So that is where it stands. So maybe my colleague Anand sir, if you want to add something. Okay.
So how much support are we getting from other countries on this text on the transparency part and the intellectual property right which you mentioned for the TRIPS?
So as far as TRIPS is concerned, if you remember, I mean, more than 100 countries were supporting India on the
Currently,
TRIPS waiver proposal, which India had proposed, and India and South Africa initially they had placed, and then number of countries joined as co-sponsors. We had 65 co-sponsors, and many members they had actually supported from the floor. So we had good support for the TRIPS waiver proposal, but a lot of discussions have happened after that. So now we will have to see. I mean, the discussions are now in an advanced stage, as I would say. So a lot of convergence is happening on different things. So let's see what the outcome is.
are you seeing a shift in developed world view also? Any indication from US?
When they said that they are for waiver on COVID vaccine, patent waiver on COVID vaccine, and US has been engaging quite positively on that. And the reason why the proposal is getting discussed, and we are thrashing out the final elements of it. So countries are engaging on that. I can say that.
So when we know that TRIPS
So as soon as we come to know, we will let you know.
when the trip will end,
सर्विस सेक्टर में क्या प्रपोजल दिया इंडिया ने सर, जो टेलीमेडिसिन
हाँ हाँ, तो उसमें अगर मैं बताऊं आपको, तो 3 चीज़ें हम लोगों ने कही हैं उसके अंदर। एक तो हमने कहा है कि जैसे मैंने आपको बताया कि सर्विस सेक्टर जो हैं वो काफ़ी अफेक्ट होते हैं कोविड के टाइम पे, स्पेशली जो कॉन्टैक्ट बेस्ड सर्विस सेक्टर हैं, जैसे हमारा टूरिज़्म है, ट्रांसपोर्टेशन है, वो तो ऑलमोस्ट बंद ही हो गए थे, क्योंकि रिस्ट्रिक्शन लग गई थी लोगों के आने जाने पर, तो वो ऑलमोस्ट बंद हो गए थे, तो वो काफ़ी अफेक्ट हुए हैं। और इसी तरह जो हमारा क्या कहते हैं लॉजिस्टिक्स है, वो भी, क्योंकि गुड्स की मूवमेंट भी जो है काफ़ी अफेक्ट हुई थी। तो हमने ये कहा कि ये सेक्टर्स बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट हैं, इनको ड्यूरिंग द पैंडमिक ये काफ़ी सफ़र किए हैं। इसके अलावा कुछ ऐसे सेक्टर भी हैं जिन्होंने काफ़ी कंट्रीब्यूट किया है पैंडमिक से डील करने में। जैसे मैंने बताया आपको, आईटी सर्विसेज है, और टेलीकम्युनिकेशन सर्विसेज है, फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज है। तो स्पेशली जो डिजिटल सर्विसेज हैं, उनके कारण बहुत सारा जो काम है वो हम लोग कर पाए, क्रिटिकल सर्विसेज दे पाए। अगर ये सर्विसेज नहीं रहती तो बहुत डिफ़िकल्ट होता पैंडमिक से डील करना। तो एक तो हमने ये कहा है कि इन सभी सर्विसेज को हमें प्रायोरिटी में देखना होगा फ्यूचर पैंडमिक्स के लिए, और हमें ये देखना होगा कि इसमें हम इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड इनमें हम और क्या सुधार कर सकते हैं, इनकी ट्रेड में हम और क्या सुधार कर सकते हैं। अगर आज मैं टेलीमेडिसिन सर्विस देता हूँ इंडिया में, क्या मैं वो टेलीमेडिसिन सर्विसेज इंडिया से बाहर भी दे सकता हूँ? क्योंकि अगर किसी देश में मान लीजिए डॉक्टर्स जो हैं वो उनको भी कोविड हो जाता है या कोई और प्रॉब्लम होती है या नर्सिंग की प्रोफेशनल्स कम हो जाते हैं, तो क्या उनका मूवमेंट हो सकता है? क्या हम सर्विसेज जो हैं वैसे दे सकते हैं? तो इस तरह का हम लोगों ने काफ़ी प्रपोजल्स हमने उसके अंदर दिए, तो उसमें हमें पॉजिटिव रिस्पांस मिला है। अभी फाइनल टेक्स्ट क्या आती है वो मैं नहीं बता सकता, लेकिन हमने सर्विसेज का भी जो बेसिकली कंट्रीब्यूशन है जो इसमें डील करने में, वो हम लोगों ने उसको उसके अंदर काफ़ी 2-3 पैरास के अंदर क्लियरली उसको हमने लेकर आए हैं।
इंडिया का इनिशिएटिव है
ये इंडिया की तरफ से ही इसको हम लोगों ने पुश किया था।
मतलब हम इंडिया का इनिशिएटिव नहीं कहेंगे क्योंकि टेक्स्ट का पार्ट है, तो
सबका इनिशिएटिव।
You talked about convergence on the TRIPS issue. Yesterday in the plenary, Catherine Tai very categorically said that the US has embraced this idea, notify India and South Africa. Now, do you see more convergence on this side with, since the US is already in the plenary and speaking about it? Where do you see the divergence happening? Are there some big nations who are parents to pharma companies who are still blocking it?
So I would say that there are different views on this particular subject. So India and South Africa proposed a particular proposal, and a lot of countries, as I mentioned, they co-sponsored and then supported also. But some countries had a different view on this particular subject. But due to continuous discussions over last few months, so there has been some convergence. Now, where do we finally reach? It's very difficult for me to say. But I think everybody now recognizes that there is a need to deal with the intellectual property right element.
Because the Swiss have categorically said that it will be against the interest of manufacturers as well as it will be detrimental to the spread of the vaccine.
So actually the principles on which we have been working is that it is not a permanent measure. It is a temporary measure to deal with COVID. We are not saying, at no point of time India has said that we are against innovation. We are the biggest proponent of innovation. We want more and more research to happen. We want protection to intellectual property. But during COVID, during the pandemic, you need certain flexibilities. So the balance of rights of intellectual property holders and the balance of public health has to be there. So that is something which we are saying, and that is only temporary, and that is only restricted to certain situations under certain conditionalities, so that it is not construed as an overarching kind of a relaxation of intellectual property rights or dilution of the I would say obligations which are there.
Sir, my question is, sir, like you mentioned that also about besides COVID-19 vaccines, also about diagnostics and therapeutics.
Yeah.
And because that is not part of the draft text, right? That diagnostic medicine and therapy. Are we still pushing for it? And do you think there's a possibility? Is it I would say, is it realistic to get something on that? And also the re-export issues.
Yeah. So on the diagnostics and therapeutics, it is very much there on the table. I can only say that. In what form it will come, whether it will come, it is very difficult for me to prejudge the result of the negotiations, but that is there in the text. The vaccines, the diagnostics, as well as the therapeutics. So it is there. The second thing, when you mentioned about the re-export, so one is export. So the proposal basically says that all countries will not have manufacturing capacity to manufacture vaccines or therapeutics in their own territory. So there is a need for export. But once you get an export, whether you can indulge in re-export of that. So there has to be some conditionalities attached to that. I think there is some convergence on that. because no one wants to misuse any particular provision. Everyone wants to enable export to deal with a crisis. So both the things are there, and I think there is discussion going on these elements.
And India is pressing for both the things, right? India is also pushing.
Yeah, India has been a proponent of inclusion of therapeutics and diagnostics also in the solution. And India has also been saying that we don't want any circumvention as far as exports or re-exports are concerned. We only want that exports are permitted for dealing with pandemic and humanitarian crisis.
Similarly, sir, it's not just patents, it's the other IPRs also, because the draft doesn't really say that at the moment.
Yeah, so when we started with number of, intellectual property rights. We started with patents, copyrights, industrial designs, and trade secrets. But due to lack of kind of support on certain other intellectual property rights, I think it has narrowed down to patents. So, but discussions are going on. Can't say at this stage as to what is the final thing, but yes, discussions have narrowed it down to patents as of now.